Welcome everybody to the second part of the COVID pilgrimage. Next week we'll be gathering together at Lifeway in person. But this week we're going to explore what the final stage of this COVID pilgrimage might look like and might be asking of us. So let's just recap the first stages of the pilgrimage that I took you through last week. So the first stage, if you remember, is the stage of disorientation. That's when everything feels up in the air. Everything feels turned upside down. Nothing makes sense anymore. The second stage is when you start to settle in to a new rhythm. So you realise you've got to do the journey your own way. There's no point looking around you and judging yourself against how others are doing or what others are doing. You have to get into your own rhythm. You have to walk your own Camino. And in this stage, you've started to unhook yourself from the expectations that you might have of what this time would be like and what you would be like in this time. And just as you're starting to find a new rhythm, that's when you find that a lot of things start to fall apart. Because this journey has been going on for a little while, the stresses and the strains start to take their toll. So on a walking pilgrimage, your feet, your blisters, your body just really starts to pack it in. And not only that, but you're tired, so mentally and spiritually you start to feel a bit exhausted. And we looked at how that might reflect some of the stages of this COVID pandemic pilgrimage. So things are falling apart, but that's not the end of the story. We move then into stage 4, which is when we really start to find our groove. We've accepted the way things are. We've started to move in a different way. We've started to realise that this is life as it is at the moment. And in a way, it's starting to feel okay. You're starting to think, I can do this. I might be able to cope here. I'm finding a way through this maze of pilgrimage. And then we come to the end. We start to see the end approaching. We can see it on the horizon. We can see the spires of that cathedral at Santiago de Compostela in the distance, in the mist. And then all at once we're walking into the plaza and we're looking up at the cathedral and we realise it's done. And now we're looking ahead and going, well, next week we can meet together, or now we can travel for further distances. We can do more. We can begin to get our lives back on track. And it feels like this is the end. But of course, there's one more stage to go. And that is the stage where we turn towards home, where we arrive at home. So let's explore this final stage of our COVID pilgrimage, coming home. I clearly remember when I was walking to Santiago that I longed to come home. And then when I finally was at that point, walking in my back door at East Devonport after being away for almost 3 months, I just noticed immediately that something had changed. I knew I was not the same person. I don't know why it suddenly hit me like that, but I realised as I looked around my house, which was exactly the same as when I left it, everything was, nothing had changed there. I was the person who had changed. I was different. I was a completely different person and I didn't know who I was. And I remember turning to Mark and saying, I can live anywhere. Now, up until this time, I had felt very deeply rooted in here, this place, this state, this place was very close to my heart and I felt very rooted here. But now there was a visceral sense in me that I could be anywhere. And in fact, I noticed a desire in me, a willingness to be transplanted. And this was a huge surprise. I had not expected that. I did not see this coming. And that might not seem like it was very a big deal to you, but for me, that was absolutely earth-shaking. But the problem was that everything else was exactly the same. So I looked the same and I sounded the same and I was doing the same things, but something in me was profoundly different. And I really felt that I needed to just slot back into the way things are, the regular routines and my commitments and, things that I was doing at home, but I just couldn't do it. And fortunately, and I don't know whether this was just God's provision for me at that time, I had arranged before we went away that after we returned, I would house sit for a friend in Hobart for 3 weeks who was travelling overseas. And so I took myself off to Hobart for 3 weeks with my journal, with my photos, with myself, and I just allowed myself some time to be with this change. I was glad to be back where culture, life was familiar, but inside I realised I was really searching for something different. I couldn't just go back to how I was. Now, like any analogy, the analogy of returning to a house is imperfect when we're looking at returning to being together in person at Lifeway, because actually there are going to be some significant physical differences when we gather together. Things like needing to be 1.5 metres physically distant, things like hand sanitizer everywhere, thermometers, temperatures, doing all those things that we need to do to stay safe and to be in this new way of living. So some things are going to be different. But it's not just the physical differences that are going to unsettle us, I think. It's how we feel as we re-enter a communal space to worship and be together. We're all going to react to this in different ways. Some of us are really all raring to go and can't wait to get into the building and see each other. Others of us maybe are a little bit hesitant and thinking, am I ready for that? Is that what I want to do? And it's a bit of a challenge. So what are you expecting as you think about gathering together next week? What are you looking forward to? What perhaps are you a little bit anxious about? It's worth taking time to just think about that before we come together next week. But even though it sounds like it will be a really unsettling time, it's also, I think, a really creative time. And I don't think we should underestimate this, because this is an amazing opportunity for us to see ourselves with fresh eyes. Why would it be like this? Why would this be a creative time? Well, because God has been changing us. God has been working in us over a period of several months, and we are all shifting and changing in the process. Of course, the temptation that we all have is to resist any kind of change, because change can be deeply unsettling. So we might want to turn a deaf ear to what God has been saying, or refuse to follow what the Spirit is inviting us into. To not let God change us and bring about a real transformation. Our verse last week was from Psalm 84, and I concentrated on verse 5, which reads, "Blessed are those whose strength is in you, who have set their hearts on pilgrimage." Well, this week I want us to turn our attention to Romans 12, verses 1 to 2, and I'm reading from the Message. Romans 12, 1 to 2. So, here's what I want you to do, God helping you. Take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work and walking life, and place it before God as an offering. Embracing what God does for you is the best thing you can do for Him. Don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God. you'll be changed from the inside out. Readily recognise what he wants from you and quickly respond to it. Unlike the culture around you, always dragging you down to its level of immaturity, God brings the best out of you, develops well-formed maturity in you. I love the way that Eugene Peterson puts it. Take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. Embracing what God does for you is the best thing that you can do for him. So what might this mean in our personal walk with Jesus and in our community here at Lifeway? Well, it can mean many things, but one book that I've been looking at just recently and revisiting is a book that inspires me to think very differently about my journey with Jesus. It's called Punk Monk, New Monasticism and the Ancient Art of Breathing. And it's by Andy Freeman and Peter Greig. Look, I'll be honest, I bought it for the title. It was in a clearance bin in a Christian bookshop, and I just was intrigued by that title. It was written in 2007, and it's about the beginnings of the 24/7 boiler room prayer movement, which began way back in the early 2000s. I've always been interested in new ways of being Christian community together, and fresh expressions of how to be God's people. And so this book really caught my attention. In the book, Andy Freeman and Peter Greig ask, are our agendas, our ambitions, even our good causes, getting in the way of us being available to be used by God? They say, as we lay down the baggage of our ministries, we can travel light and be readily led by Christ. What? The baggage of our ministries? Aren't they challenging words? But as we've been forced to lay down our ministries and our programs, our meeting together, our worshipping together, our fellowshipping together, what has moved into the space that opened up? What has God been inviting you to consider as you have let go of the way things were? As you have let go of your ministries or your programs or just the regular routines of being a Christian community of faith. Obviously, this book wasn't dreaming of such a time as this. Back in 2007, I think the idea of global pandemics flitted somewhere around the background of our thinking, but did not, I don't think, enter into our actual thinking it would happen to us. This time, now that we're living in, when all the usual structures and supports and ministries, all the services that we do have been swept away, and so completely and so quickly, I don't think would have entered into the minds of the authors at that time. But they ask a question which I think is really relevant for this time. And it asks us, now that we've laid down a lot of our usual routines, ministries, structures, are we more available to Christian ministry than to Christ himself? Are we more available to Christian ministry than to Christ himself? Well, surely they're the same thing, aren't they? Well, hopefully they are, and often they are, but sometimes, well, honestly, they're not. And perhaps this COVID time is allowing us to at least consider where God really is for us personally and for us at Lifeway, and where he may be calling us to follow him now in this new way of being community in this COVID pandemic time. Another book I've been reading during this time is by one of my favourite spirituality authors. Her name is Margaret Silf, and she wrote a book called Wayfaring. And in that book, she shares a really great image, which I think captures this stage where we're at in our COVID pilgrimage, this coming home stage. She asks us to imagine that we live across the road from a farm. Now, that's not too hard for us, is it? Because living in such a regional agricultural area. She says, imagine living across the road from a farm, and there's a large field or a paddock, and in it has been planted a crop. Now, it doesn't matter what crop. It might be wheat. It could be potatoes. It might be poppies. Whatever that crop is, just take a moment now to imagine yourself living across the road from a farm that is growing a beautiful crop. And over the season, that crop has grown and increased and ripened. Now, imagine that you've come to the point where this crop has ripened and is now ready to be harvested. And let's say that overnight, that whole field is harvested and reploughed. So one morning, you walk out of your door and you look across at this beautiful field that yesterday was filled with poppies or with wheat. And all of a sudden, the entire landscape has changed. The familiar rows and tracks have disappeared. Hidden things under the ground have been turned up with the blades of the plough. The terrain is completely turned over. It's rutted and muddy and unfamiliar. And if you wanted to walk through this paddock, it would be incredibly difficult. The old crop has completely gone. Everything seems open and empty and without form and without purpose. But Margaret Silf invites us to look more closely at this scene. The seeds, the rubble, the life that's been uncovered is attracting birds. They swoop down, they flock across what looks like an empty field, drawn by the promise of fresh food that has just been uncovered. They come and they feast on the newly turned soil. What seemed empty to them is full of promise. And she says to us, Jesus traversed the fields of the human heart with the blades of truth and love. The old inhabitants were stripped of their solid ground and challenged into a reappraisal, and a new flock followed in the wake of this new ploughman because they found food that satisfied their longing. Imagine Lifeway and Devonport and Tasmania as this field that has been ploughed, turned upside down, and all the familiar patterns removed. What might Jesus be inviting us to do with this newly ploughed field? Let's not become so preoccupied with getting back to church that we miss the important and transforming work God has been doing in us, jolting us out of ruts and routines that haven't been helpful and aren't from Him, and clearing a path to allow God's Spirit to move in fresh, new ways. Maybe, as we return, it all does look very similar to what has been, but in its heart, at the heart, it is completely transformed by the Spirit of God. I find that a really exciting prospect. We have the opportunity to look at the familiar with fresh eyes. Can we allow God to use the upheaval of these last few months to show us how we can follow Jesus in the same places but with a different heart, with different eyes? As you become drawn into your familiar routines and networks and rituals that have been on hold for months, what are you noticing? What is filling you with joy? What's helpful as you return to those routines and networks? What's difficult and draining? And what might that be saying to you about what God is doing in your life? As we reconsider the shifting parameters of our day-to-day life, what draws you in and excites you? What new possibilities are emerging for you? A lot is shifting in our community and in our country, and one of the biggest social shifts that I'm noticing at the moment is that we have suddenly become a lot less mobile. As we focus more on our local regions, we are suddenly aware that we are no longer able to travel in the way that we used to. We can't visit family interstate. We've had to cancel holidays overseas. All sorts of things are changing. We are much less mobile. I mean, how long ago was it that we could only travel 30 kilometres? And it seemed like such a strange thing to not even be able to go to Launceston to go shopping. It was really odd. So as we become more local in our focus, what does that mean for you? In his book Future Shock, which was published, can I say, in 1970, Alvin Toffler wrote that Western society was experiencing an historic decline in the significance of place to human life. And he claimed that we were breeding a race of modern nomads. And that was in 1970, and I think even as we look at our society now, we can see how that became more and more true. In one fell swoop, this nomadic impulse has been halted. We are all stuck where we were when this pandemic hit, and it's very difficult to move out of that place, that geographical area. Simon Carey Holt, in his book God Next Door, says, God's call is not a call to be everywhere, it's a call to be somewhere. It's not a call to be everywhere, it's a call to be somewhere. Where is your somewhere? He's calling us to be fully present where we are, embodying and proclaiming the good news of Jesus in our immediate context. Your neighbourhood has become your mission field. I guess it always was, but when we had horizons that stretched on infinitely, it might have been a bit hard to restrict ourselves and think of the place where we actually live and go to work and do our day-to-day activities. But now that's all changed. And maybe this is a gift that comes from closing our once transient, displaced way of life and opening up a place of deeper connection with where we really live and breathe every day. I don't think I've seen so many people out walking as I have during the first few weeks of lockdown. It almost felt like I was back in Spain, enjoying a paseo. This was something that I loved about Spain, and it really took me by surprise when I first encountered it. So we would get into a village, however small, or a city, however large, and in the evening, around about 7 or 8 o'clock at night, suddenly the streets would be filled with families, with grandmothers and grandfathers, with their grandchildren, with parents and with siblings and with friends, all walking together, chatting and calling out greetings, watching children learn how to ride bikes, holding toddlers' hands, showing off babies. It was just beautiful, a real communal expression of connection. I loved Paseo. I actually wonder what's happened in Spain as they've had to pull away from that beautiful practice of community. I loved it because everybody was out enjoying everybody else's company and living community together. And they were out there, rain or shine. What would it be like to see our neighbourhood as a place of the Spirit, a place where we could walk and engage and communicate with our neighbours and with our friends? The invitation to immerse ourselves more meaningfully in our local community and bringing the good news to life, I think, is one of the great gifts that might emerge out of this COVID pilgrimage that we've been experiencing. I want to finish with another quote from Punk Monk. And remember, this book was written in 2007. Andy Freeman writes, "The gospel spreads from person to person like a contagious, life-giving virus. Too often my attempts at evangelism resemble a person trying desperately to pass on to others an illness that I am not carrying." He asks, are we infectious with the gospel? I'm hearing those words in a completely new way in this COVID pandemic time. Dare I suggest, this is the kind of community transmission that our community really needs. So how do we become infectious with the gospel? Well, that's a subject for another day, and it might be good to talk about that in your Zoom groups this morning. But let me leave you with some of Andy Freeman's suggestions. He says, breathe in the presence of Jesus in prayer. I love that. Breathe in the presence of Jesus in prayer. And as we receive from God in prayer, we are changed slowly, often more slowly than we'd like, and we become the message we are called to preach. Resist the need to fill space by doing something. And take those opportunities of emptiness and openness to pray and connect with God. He suggests taking regular short fasts from food, maybe, but also from technology or activity, or whatever it is that you use to distract yourself. And instead of doing that distracting activity, focus on God in prayer. He invites us to be ready, to be hospitable, to be available, to be used by God wherever we are. Ready to be interrupted, ready to welcome, ready to reach out in love. And pray with your eyes open, like the Celtic Christians did, in the midst of everyday life. Amid daily activities, they noticed where God was and they acknowledged his presence with them. So as we come to a close, here's what I want you to do, God helping you. Take your ordinary, everyday life, your sleeping, eating, going to work and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. Embracing what God does for you is the best thing you can do for him. Don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God. You'll be changed from the inside out. Readily recognise that what he wants from you and quickly respond to it. Unlike the culture around you, always dragging you down to its level of immaturity, God brings out the best in you, develops well-formed maturity in you. Let's close by saying the Lord's Prayer together. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread, and forgive us our sins, as we forgive those who sin against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours, now and forever. Amen.